This is sort of a more broad thing, but when I hear like the phrase like open up political space, I know that his political like leanings are more economic, but I just like wonder about like the social aspects that are opened up. And I think you guys mentioned in the Not Just an Artifact article about him proposing that like gay marriage be open for a popular vote. But I'm just wondering, does this general like increase in protest culture come with more like liberal social change as well? Or do you think that because it's so rooted in the economic that it's just bound to continue down that path?
First off, I wouldn't say that it's a purely economic thing, but I do think that social kind of cultural issues, I don't suspect there'll be much evolution in that direction. Like Navalny comes across to me as, somewhat of a social libertarian, except when it comes to immigration issues, where he's quite, has a really horrible past of being a nationalist, essentially. And he is and has been described as somewhat of a liberal nationalist. And his degradation of people from Central Asia and who are, horribly, horribly exploited people. And there have been some awful, awful cases over the last couple of years of people from Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and other places in the Caucasus who are literally held in slavery. So he does have this very, very dark spot.
Held in slavery where? Their home country?
No, in, say, a basement in the outskirts of Moscow. There was one story I remember in particular that they found, like, I forget the numbers, but it was in the tens, mostly women, of course, I think from Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, that were literally like held in slavery. Russia does have a very large immigrant labor force, both legal and illegal. So he, in his statements, he's come out, unfortunately, basically racist in some respects, and Russian ethno-nationalist, which is a major. This is one of the problems. Like Russian ethno-nationalism is even the Kremlin doesn't dabble too deeply in that stuff. And his economic, from what we can tell from his economic positions, they're more or less neoliberal.
Okay, this might sound pretty naive, but are there examples of like political movements or like visible cultural movements that have been like social issues based? Or is that something that just like doesn't compel the Russian population as a whole as much as like labor and economic issues might?
I mean, there's in St. Petersburg in particular, there's a LGBT community, activist community. But these issues just don't really translate. I mean, if you want to put it in kind of a crude comparative, gay rights in Russia is similar to what gay rights were in the late 70s and early 80s in the United States. Now we have this, basically state-sponsored homophobia. Feminism, for example, doesn't seem to communicate, at least has a very strong voice either in Russia. So I think that these social issues, it's going to take a lot of time, which is ironic. Especially the feminist issue is ironic because at least Soviet discourse had a recognition of women's rights and women's equality. Right. The same thing with race. Right. The Soviet ideology had a discourse of, racial harmony and anti-racism. And it's a real unfortunate thing that, I mean, one of the tragedies of the collapse of the Soviet system is that this discourse is completely gone.
Yeah, discourse, but I don't know. Like, I don't know how much on the ground that actually played out the way it may have sounded, like friendship of nations, la la la. But that doesn't mean that people in their day-to-day lives were necessarily like particularly tolerant. Or I don't actually know. I don't know.
Sure, it's more mixed. I mean, it was more mixed because you also get articulations of people in kind of a nostalgic frame, right? For when we had these contacts with, Africans and Central Americans and South Americans, where when we read about the struggles of Latin American peoples in the newspaper, and we felt some like affinity and pride. I mean, I think I don't want to overstate that it was some sort of like, lovely utopia here. But I think the discourse was important.
And there wouldn't have been really, it didn't sort of like make sense geopolitically to have any kind of like anti-immigration quote unquote discourse. Specifically when we talk about immigration in Russia, we're talking about, like, as you mentioned, the countries are Central Asia. Because those are part of the Soviet Union, there wasn't like a debate about like people coming across borders and coming in this sort of more like
in like a strict way where like borders are stagnant.
Or like there would be like the reality of populations were being moved around during the Soviet Union, but now like this unidirectional, like people coming from Central Asia to come to Moscow, mostly in St. Petersburg, but to come to Russia basically to find better wages. That's been intensifying in the post-Soviet years, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, because, for example, I think it's Kyrgyzstan, over a quarter, if I'm not mistaken, over a quarter of its GDP is remittances from immigrant labor in Russia formally. And, so their economy is completely dependent upon remittances back. Where in the Soviet period, for all its faults, you still had kind of an investment of the state, central, Soviet state in the regions. I mean, this is part of one of the resentments of Russian ethno-nationalists, right?
Wait, one of the resentments is that the money made in Russia is going out to these non-Russian states, you mean?
Yeah, one of the resentments is that, two things. First off, the Soviet state was not a Russian state. It was a multi-ethnic state. And it was a state that invested and developed the periphery at the expense of the center. So it developed, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and, Georgia and even Chechnya and all of these places at the expense of Russians, quote unquote. This is one of the resentments, because if you look at it, there's never been a Russian nation state. Even in the imperial period, it was never a Russian ethno state. It was never a Russian nation state like, say, Germany or France. It was always more like the United States in this sense. This doesn't mean to say that there isn't Russian cultural and ethnic hegemony, but nevertheless, it is not an ethno-state.